be a screw, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 11th part of, What If Issei, Rias enters solo leveling. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of YagamiNguyen on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. It was the night of the alarm belt that woke him up in the middle of the night, 3 days after the fight against the Kuza beast. Issei. Issei. The urgent voice and the sound of the belt, one that Issei had hoped he would never hear while setting it up with Frank, ripped him from his sleep, his eyes snapping open and heart racing from the sudden jolt. With his natural night vision, even in the dim candlelight, Issei could see quite clearly the familiar face of Mamoru, a young healer a few years older than him. Mamoru-san. What's going on? Issei asked, springing out of bed instantly, standing in front of her. The sleepiness vanished in an instant when he saw the nervousness and fear in her eyes. Ice elves, they are gathering outside our gate at the moment. Mamoru answered, leaving Issei to widen his eyes in shock. Sieghart had mentioned them to him before, and they were the most dangerous enemies a raid could face in a snow environment gate, by a wide margin, having earned their name due to their resemblances to the elves of their world, tall, graceful, attractive with long elven ears and snowy white hair to pair with their pale blue skin. But that was where the similarities ended. These monsters were just as ruthless as they were deadly in battle, and those who had survived encounters with them had stopped calling them elves altogether, instead referring to them as ice wraiths, a name that better suited their brutal nature. And coincidentally, they were the same creatures that had been haunting his dream. Grabbing his coat, Issei sprinted out of his cabin with Mamoru. The cold air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, but the Sekuriyudai ignored it as he ran as quickly as he could to the front gate. The usual silence of the hideaway at this hour had vanished. Shouted orders echoed through the night, and warriors hurried to their pre-assigned positions, their armor clanging as they moved swiftly on the snow-covered ground, preparing for battle. Sieghart-san. Issei called upon reaching the front gate, wasting no time to climb the wooden steps leading up to the top. As soon as he reached the place where Sieghart was standing with the other captains, Issei could see them, the ice elves, standing in the darkness with their eyes glowing like some ghostly under the moonlight. There had to be at least 100, and each and every one of them carried in their hands a different set of weapons, from swords, daggers, to spear and bows and arrows, all of which seemed to glow faintly with an ethereal, frosty light. Riding ahead of them on a magnificent steed that seemed to glide effortlessly across the snow was an elf with a distinctive look. His appearance was striking, with long, white hair that seemed to stick out in all directions. His glowing eyes had an almost eerie intensity to match the cruel smirk that he was wearing on his face. A purple, leaf-shaped pattern adorned the center of his forehead while the collar and shoulder parts of his blue parka was lined with white fur, giving him a regal air that radiated a sense of authority. If you are asking me, I think that elf's probably the boss of this gate. Sieghart stated, knowing exactly who Issei was looking at. What are they doing? Why haven't they attacked us yet? Issei asked, his tone laced with concern, as ice elves were known for their stealth ability. If they had wanted, they could have snuck in that way, not that Issei and the camp didn't have any measurement against such a method, so it was really strange for them to come to the gate for a direct confrontation like this. Also, how did they get so close to? Issei stopped mid-sentence, his gaze drifting toward the guard posts he had assigned his shadow soldiers to, getting his answer before he could finish asking the question. Both the shadow trooper and assassin stationed there were completely encased in ice, frozen in place like statues with their weapons still gripped tightly in their hands. They must have used some kind of sheath ability to take out your shadows from a distance. As for why they didn't just sneak in and slit our throats while we were sleeping, I have no idea. Good thing the patrols noticed them, or our throats would probably have been slit in our sleep. Sieghart said, crossing his arms over his chest, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword. As if on cue, the horse-riding elf suddenly spurred his steed forward, its hooves crunching through the snow as it came to a stop just a few meters from the gate. The smirk that the spiky-haired elf on his face widened as he looked up and surveyed the gathered defenders, turning slowly over the group, one by one, before finally settling on Issei, who met his gaze fearlessly. So, the MSTR of those shadow minions finally arrives. The elf said, his voice carrying clearly through the still night air. His tone was mocking, but there was also something else, curiosity, perhaps. You want to see me? Is that the reason why you are here? Issei replied coolly, his tone carrying just enough edge in it to show he wasn't intimidated. A sharp silence fell over both sides as the elf blinked, his jaw hanging slightly open as he observed Issei, showing much more interest than before. Oh, so you do speak our tongue? Issei raised an eyebrow, momentarily taken aback. He quickly glanced over at Sieghart and the captains, only to find them staring at him, their eyes wide with shock and astonishment. Sieghart, recovering first, broke the silence, his voice laced with disbelief. You can communicate with them, Issei? Issei blinked, confused by their reaction. You guys can't? He asked, still processing what had just happened. His gaze shifted between Sieghart and the other captains before he reached a conclusion. Must be because I am a... No, Issei. No one can, not even your kind with your language ability. Sieghart interrupted, shaking his head. And we just heard you speaking in their language. No one here can do that. I can confirm, partner. Drake's voice echoed in his mind, leaving Issei in a state of shock, wondering if it had anything to do with the system and its effect on him. Well, it certainly is fortuitous that we can understand each other, make things so much easier. The elf leader spoke up, turning Issei's attention back to him to see the amused smirk returning to his face. The name is Baruka. Regaining his composure, Issei replied, his tone firm, Issei Hayadu. Very well, Issei Hayadu. The others and I came here tonight to make a proposition. Baruka began, his hand gesturing to the side toward the other elves. I'm confident you may find the offer palpable as well. He paused, his glowing eyes narrowing as they locked onto Issei with keen interest. But before that, I must ask, why do you dwell among these creatures, when you are clearly not one of them? The F does that supposed to mean? Issei asked, cocking an eyebrow at the smirking elf, who let out a laugh as if he was amused by his response. Baruka's smirk only deepened at the response, and he let out a short, amused laugh. Oh. So, you didn't know, he said, his voice still laced with amusement. How curious. Very well, let me explain. His laughter died down to a low, almost mocking chuckle before he continued. You see, we've been watching you. Apart from the fact that you wield an interesting power and are clearly the most capable among these vermin standing around you, there's something else. You and I cannot help but feel that we're not so different. Issei narrowed his eyes at Baruka, but he decided to remain silent, waiting for the elf to continue. Slowly, he lifted a hand and pointed to his head, his voice lowering as he spoke almost conspiratorially. Did you know, there is a voice that rings incessantly in our minds, urging us to slaughter every creature of your world? He let the silence linger for a moment before continuing, yet, none of us here could hear that voice with you. Maybe it's the counterpoint to your little theory. Keep convincing yourself however you want. I can tell that you're just trying to deny the fact that you're supposed to be one of us. Baruka spread his hands out and shrugged his shoulders, making Issei harden his gaze. Regardless, that's not the reason why I have come here tonight. You see, I have no problem with you, and I do not seek to shed any more blood than necessary. Not to mention that your ability will prove problematic for us to deal with as well. What I want are the vermin you are safeguarding, the elf said, extending a hand toward Issei, who widened his eyes slightly at the demand. Hand them over to us and I shall guarantee your safety. What do you think of my offer? Hardening his gaze, Issei paused for a moment as if weighing his options before responding coldly. Before I give you my answer, let me ask you something too. Who the hell are you guys? His question hung in the air, a feeling of déjà vu washing over him, as if he had asked it before. Baruka, however, didn't seem taken aback by the inquiry, as though he understood that Issei wasn't just referring to him and the other ice elves, but something much bigger. Ah, you see. We are. BZZT. Keep convincing yourself however you want. I can tell that you're just trying to deny the fact that you're supposed to be one of us. Baruka spread his hands out and shrugged his shoulders. Regardless, that's not the reason why I have come here tonight. You see. I have no problem with you, and I do not seek to shed any more blood than necessary. Not to mention that your ability will prove problematic for us to deal with as well. What I want are the creatures you are safeguarding, the elf said, extending a hand toward Issei, who widened his eyes in shock, but not just at the demand, but at what had just happened right in front of his eyes. Just hand them over to us and I shall guarantee your safety. What do you think of my offer? Partner, did you feel that just now? I did, Drake. Issei replied to his dragon partner with a cold chill running down his spine, his gaze shifting between Baruka and the other elves as he tried to make sense of the odd repetition. Did Baruka just, glitched? Furrowing his eyebrows, Issei decided to test it, repeating the same question that he asked before. Before I give you my answer, let me ask you something too. Who the hell are you guys? Ah, you see. We are. BZZT. Keep convincing yourself however you want. I can tell that you're just trying to deny the fact that you're supposed to be one of us. Baruka spread his hands out and shrugged his shoulders, making Issei widen his eyes in stunned silence. Regardless, that's not the reason why I have come here tonight. You see. I have no problem with you, and I do not seek to shed any more blood than necessary. Not to mention that your ability will prove problematic for us to deal with as well. He repeated it again. What's going on? Issei thought as he stared oddly at Baruka, and it wasn't just his speech. Even his demeanors, his body languages were the same. What I want are the creatures you are safeguarding. The elf said, extending a hand toward Issei, who glanced over to the heroes standing next to him, seeing that no one seemed to notice what was going on. Just hand them over to us and I shall guarantee your safety. What do you think of my offer? Do you accept? It was then that Baruka continued, smirking confidently as the elves behind him did the same, readying the weapons. Silently, Issei did a hand signal for Sieghart and the captains to do the same before finally giving his answer. I refuse. How disappointing. I gave you way too much credit, as Her Majesty has so graciously pointed out. Her Majesty. Issei repeated, just as an overwhelming, icy pressure flooded the air. His inner alarm flared, the familiar feeling of impending danger washing over him like a tidal wave. Before Issei could say anything, the temperature plummeted suddenly to a degree so cold it felt as though the very air had turned to ice. Icicle impact. Issei widened his eyes as the notification window appeared before his eyes, just as Sieghart shoved him back with a hand to his chest. Get down. The blonde roared as he removed the shield from his back and held it in front of them as a large barrier of defensive magic extended out and shielded them from the imminent danger. But the defense proved to be no match for the gigantic blast of ice that collided directly with them, so intense it seemed to freeze everything in its path. It shot toward them, shattering the ground beneath their feet before doing the same thing to the defensive barrier Sieghart had created with his shield. The massive wooden structure under them was blown apart and splintered almost instantly, its remains scattering into the air like paper caught in a storm. The wall of their base crumbled while the explosion of ice sent everyone on top and standing behind it flying, sweeping off their feet, their bodies being flung away like ragdolls under the sheer force of the ice blast. Issei was thrown backward, his body unable to resist the force behind the blast. The ground rushed up to meet him as he crashed into the frozen earth, his body slamming hard against the frozen ground. Pain shot through him as his head spun, and the world around him became a blur of white and blue. Gritting his teeth, he tried to pick himself up, groaning in pain as he propped himself up on his elbows while his head rang. "Partner. Are you all right? Partner." Through the haze and cries of his dragon partner, his eyes caught the chaos that unfolded around him. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, and saw Baruka stepping confidently into the ruined grounds of the hideaway with the other elves. The smirk that he had on his face had grown even wider, almost sickening as he glanced around before turning his gaze up, just as the elves behind them lowered themselves down to their knees. Slowly, a figure descended before Baruka, floating just a foot above the ground while carrying with them an aura of frost and majesty. It was a woman, with ethereal pale blue skin, like ice that had been carved from a glacier under moonlight. Much of her body was left fully exposed, as if the cold itself didn't bother her at all, as she was wreathed in elegant blue cloth that was only a shade darker than her skin, clinging tightly to her shapely figure while revealing so much only her feminine parts were not on full display. Long, cascading white hair that was pulled back in a high ponytail tumbled down her back, shimmering faintly in the icy light, making her look both hauntingly appealing and unnervingly cold. "Milady." Baruka smirked as he placed a fist, which was holding a glowing blade of his dual daggers, on his chest and lowered his head to the woman, who surveyed the devastation with a regal calm, exuding an aura of undeniable authority. "Elva, Queen of the Ice Elves. LV, 60. A cruel smirk, one that mirrored those on her kin, spread across her face, shattering her regal facade. Slowly, Elva raised her hands and declared, "Slaughter these vermin. Bring me their heads as trophies of your victory." Gladio. Issei roared with all of his might, just as the elves unleashed an elated battle cry that could be heard throughout the entire forest. Leading his own squad, Baruka charged at the nearest group of heroes, but they were intercepted by Gladio himself, who was the first to leap out of Issei's shadows and swung his broad blade at the elves, swiftly cutting down 4 of them before engaging Baruka in combat. Sparks flew between the two as their blades met, but Baruka merely laughed maniacally in response as he held his ground against the much larger knight, pushing his much larger weapon back with just a swing of his dual daggers before dashing past him, slashing at his torso. The damage was instantly healed, however, thanks to the combined effect of his sword and regeneration, allowing him to twirl around with his broadsword swinging in a wide arc. Baruka was able to narrowly dodge the blade, though the force behind the swing was still enough to force him back, making him struggle momentarily before regaining his footing, smirking frenziedly as he twirled his blades around and readied himself. The entire battlefield, once a peaceful hideaway for the raid, was a swirling, chaotic maelstrom of clashing steel, flashing magic, and the screams of both combatants and fallen warriors from both sides. Issei unleashed every one of his available shadows into the fray while he himself dashed across the battlefield, his balance breaker blazing with raw power and the intense heat of his flame as he tore through each and every single enemy coming at him and threatening the life of his comrades with devastating power. Each strike of his gauntlet sent shockwaves rippling through the ground, toppling elves and shattering their frost-infused weapons. Ari. Just before he could utter the command to extract the shadows of the elves he had killed, Elva appeared right in front of him and placed a finger on his lips, stopping him dead on his track and freezing him in place, with his arms and legs being fully encased in ice even before he realized it. "So, you are the one that, mentioned." She spoke to him, her voice as smooth as silk but her icy breath was even colder than the air around them. Issei struggled and tried to break free, igniting his fire at full force, but the ice holding him in place continued to remain. The power of the shadows, and the power he created to rival and challenge of destruction, both in the same body. The elf queen mused, but her voice kept cutting off randomly as she trailed her graceful, slender finger down his chest. Her other hand extended outward, a graceful yet commanding motion, and the ice beneath her feet began to shift and rise. Slowly but deliberately, it morphed into the towering forms of ice walkers, the same enemies that Issei had battled countless times ever since he became trapped inside this red gate. It was, you. Issei gritted his teeth, his breath starting to become visible in the freezing air as he clenched his fists. His teeth gritted against the numbing cold that was creeping through his body, gnawing at his strength and consciousness. His aura flickered while his flame continued to struggle to burn through the oppressive ice surrounding his arms and feet. Elva smirked, a cruel and knowing expression that seemed to cut deeper than the cold itself. Yes. She whispered as she slowly leaned her face down, moving her icy cold lips toward his. It was always me. Just before she could press her mouth against his, something whipped through the air toward her, and Elva raised her arm just in time to catch the familiar sword WHP of Sieghart himself, who then charged forward and slammed his shield into with a battle cry after tearing his way through her ice walk. The impact sent her flying through the air, her cold sneer transforming into a brief grimace of shock before she crashed into the nearby cabin, splintering wood in every direction. With the Ice Queen momentarily displaced, the ice binding Issei began to crack and melt away, the chill in the air lifting just enough for him to break free. But the effort was too much for him, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Get up, Issei. A little ice is not going to keep you down, is it? Sieghart asked, offering a hand to Issei, who looked up and saw Sieghart grinning at him. Issei managed a strained chuckle, throwing his arm up to allow Sieghart to pull him to his feet. You always know how to make an entrance. Sieghart grinned. What can I say? I'm a natural. Heavenly strike. Reacting much faster this time, Issei wrapped his gauntlet in dragon flame and launched himself into the air, smashing through the giant block of ice that was dropped on them, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces that scattered like shards of glass. From the wreckage of the collapsed cabin, Elva emerged, her once calm demeanor replaced by a fierce, seething rage. Her eyes seemed to burn with fury despite her nature, and her aura pulsed like a blizzard, cold and violent. Insolent insects! She screamed, her voice a chilling screech that cut through the air. You will pay for that. I take that she's angry. Sieghart remarked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he readied himself, his sword WHP strapping itself back while his shield remained firm in his other hand. She's the boss, isn't she? Accept Sieghart to your party. Y/N. We kill her. This nightmare ends. Issei said, punching his palm with a fist of flame after confirming the party creation. The green jewels on the back of dragon gauntlets seemed to glow brighter as he stepped forward with Sieghart, their eyes locking on Elva with unwavering resolve. With a vicious scream, Elva moved her hands forward, sending a barrage of ice spikes hurtling toward the two of them. Sieghart moved first, positioning himself defensively in front of Issei, who then waited for his moment to dash over the blonde and rushed at Elva as she focused her attack on Sieghart. Before he could reach her, however, a massive chunk of ice produced from the ground, halting his advance before shattering just as Elva turned her right hand to him and unleashed a blast of icy wind, instantly cutting through the heat of his flames and chilling him to the bone. Issei gritted his teeth against the cold, struggling to maintain his footing as the frost spread across his limbs. Before the ice could get trapped again, Issei unleashed the full force of his flames and summoned his dragon wings, taking off with a burst of speed. The ground cracked and groaned as pillars of ice rose up, aiming to impale Issei through his guts as he weaved through them to get to Elva. Sieghart swung his sword WHP at the elf queen, but she froze the weapon completely mid-swing before throwing one of the ice spikes at him like a spear. Rather than attempting to block, Sieghart dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the lethal projectile. The spike tore through the air, missing him by inches. And instead crashed into the shadows fighting the elves behind him, tearing through all of them as it left a deep rift on the ground. As his shadows regenerated, Issei launched himself at Elva, avoiding a shard of ice to throw his flaming gauntlet at Elva, but she reacted instantly, summoning a wall of ice in front of her that absorbed the blow with a loud hiss. Her eyes then flared with anger as she made the ice wall shatter into million pieces, which then stopped in midair and turned their sharp, pointy edge at Issei before flying at him, slashing and cutting into his skin as he was sent flying back while using both of his arms to protect his face. Sieghart tried to rush to his aid, but Elva sent him flying with a pillar of ice, which she then whirled around and threw at Issei next, making it crash into him with a devastating force. Issei groaned in pain as he was sent sprawling across the ground, feeling the weight of the entire ice pillar crashing into him while the blood dripped from the gashes all over his body, staining his clothes and the earth beneath him in the same color of his gauntlet. His flames and the defensive aura of his balance breaker flickered weakly, barely holding against the cold that seeped into his very bones. Weak! Elva roared with mocking laughter as she summoned a long spear and threw it at Issei, aiming directly at his heart. Before the spear could reach its target, Sieghart arrived just in time, his shield raised to guard Issei from the lethal attack. The force of the impact rattled his shield, but he stood his ground, giving Issei the precious moment he needed to catch his breath before quickly opening his inventory to bring out a greater healing potion and chug it down. Feeling some of his strength returning to him, Issei nodded his head to Sieghart, and the blonde brought his fist back to punch his shield with all of his might, sending out a shockwave toward Elva that forced her to fly to the side to dodge. In a seamless motion, Sieghart reached for a small dagger strapped to his belt. With a swift flick of his wrist, he hurled the blade at Elva. The projectile sliced through the air with deadly precision, nearly invisible in the surrounding darkness, its trajectory aimed right at the face of the elf queen, who widened her eyes as she sensed the incoming threat, turning her head just in time to avoid the thrown weapon. But in doing so, it gave Issei the opening he needed as he flew at her from the side, having slipped out from behind Sieghart the moment that Elva turned her gaze away to dodge the dagger. Elva immediately conjured another ice wall between the two of them to protect herself, but Issei was fully prepared for it this time, using two phoenix shifts in quick succession. The first he used to move to the side, leaving behind a fiery silhouette of himself before following up with the second one to launch himself at the Ice Queen. Boost! Boost! Skill activated, penetrate. Boosting his power up as many times as he could, Issei then activated the penetrate ability of his sacred gear just as his knuckle made contact with her cheek, sending Ayla soaring through the air before crashing into the huge chunk of ice created by her own icicle impact. The massive ice block exploded upon her landing, making shards fly in every direction as the elf queen disappeared into the huge chunk of ice. Even the elves were stunned, as they stared at the wreckage with a mixture of shock, unable to believe that their queen had been defeated so easily. But then, the brief moment of victory was shattered, as the huge block of ice broke apart into million pieces as Ayla shot into the air. The right half of her face was horribly burnt, but her left eye gleamed with an ominous, almost unnatural light. Her lips curled into a snarl, and a blood-curdling shriek tore through the air, echoing across the battlefield. "You think, you can defeat me so easily?" Elva snarled with her hands raised high above her head, her power surging, swirling around her in a dangerous, volatile storm of ice. The temperature around her plummeted as she gathered every bit of her power, generating an intense blue aura from her body that was so cold the very air around seemed to freeze in her wake. "All of you will die here. Diamond dust." Issei gasped as he saw the notification of the technique, while the ground beneath them trembled under the intense pressure of her power. With a vicious snarl, Elva brought her hands down, then moved them forward, unleashing a massive blast of icy winds with glistening shards of ice swirling around it at Issei and Sieghart, who immediately planted his shield down and got on one knee to brace himself against the overwhelming force. "We need to block this attack or she's going to kill everyone. Get behind me, Issei!" the hero shouted. Instantly, Issei darted behind him, taking cover behind his shield just as the full force of diamond dust collided with it, instantly freezing the ground around them and spreading frost across the air and onto their bodies. The shield groaned under the pressure, its surface freezing over as the wind cut through their defenses. Gritting his teeth, Issei pressed his shoulders against the back of the shield, infusing his flames into the defense to give them a fighting chance while jagged ice spikes began to rise from the frozen earth, creeping slowly but steadily toward their lower bodies. "Hold strong, my dragon brother. Hold!" Sieghart shouted, his muscles straining to keep the shield up. Together, the two stood their ground and held back the relentless blast, even as the cold gnawed at their bones and the spikes started to dig deeper and deeper into their flesh. Eventually, just as quickly as it had come, the ice blast started to dissipate. The last of the frozen shards crumbled into the air, and the wind died down, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the crackle of frost. As the attack appeared to have taken a lot from her, Elva fell down and collapsed onto her knees, gasping for breath. Her once diamante aura flickered. The cold sheen of exhaustion was evident on her face as she struggled to keep her composure. "You still holding all right there, Issei?" "Yeah, just barely. We need to take her down now. This is our chance. Just a little more." Sieghart grunted, his voice filled with urgency as he struggled to push himself up from the frozen ground. The pain in their bodies was excruciating. The ice spikes that had impaled them now dug deeper, but the two warriors ignored the agony as they forced themselves to rise. "On 3, okay. 1, 2, 3. The moment that Sieghart finished the count, both men surged forward, shouting over the pain that tore through their bodies. The spikes that had punctured their flesh were wrenched free as they pushed themselves to their feet, with Issei unleashing his flame to melt away the frost on him, allowing him to move freely before he could help Sieghart to his feet. "Go. Finish her," Sieghart urged as he took in a deep breath to gather himself, making Issei nod his head in understanding before turning on his heels to rush at Elva, who kneeled there and stared at them in disbelief. "I will be right behind." Issei felt his heart skip a beat as he snapped his head back just before he could dash toward Elva. His gaze locked onto Sieghart, who stood frozen in his place and stared at him with a shocked expression. Blood then poured from his mouth as a long, familiar white blade erupted from his chest, causing Sieghart to finally let out a cry of pain before Baruka fully materialized behind him, smirking maniacally as he twisted his dagger. "You haven't forgotten me yet, have you?" The ice elf asked, laughing alongside his elf queen, who had put on the act the entire time to distract them. "No." Issei screamed, the raw emotion tearing through him like wildfire. His flames surged out of control as he threw himself forward faster than he had ever moved and threw a punch at Baruka with all his might. The ice elf swiftly raised his other blade to block the strike, but the force behind it was still enough to send him hurtling back through the air before he could stop himself, smirking as he readied his daggers at his sides. Before Sieghart could hit the frozen ground, Issei was there, catching him in his arms. The hero's once vibrant, full of life eyes were now dim, and his breathing was shallow, each gasp rattling in his chest. Blood soaked through his armor, staining Issei's hands as he lowered himself down. "Sieghart!" Issei cried, his voice cracking. "No, no, no. Not like this. You're going to be okay, I'll heal you. Gladio! Gladio!" Issei shouted desperately to his shadow commander, who was at his side in an instant. Forcefully, he yanked his sword from the shadow's hand and tried to get Sieghart to hold on to it. But he could see it. Even with the healing power of the blade, Sieghart's health continued to drop. The light in his eyes flickered as he coughed, blood staining his lips. "Ha! I guess, it's too late, for me." Sieghart spoke, his voice coming in labored breaths. "No. Don't say that." Issei shook his head violently as tears streamed down his cheek. "You're going to make it, Sieghart. You have to. We are supposed to go home together." Sorry, little brother." Sieghart managed a weak chuckle, though it turned into a cough as more blood spurted from his mouth. Issei desperately searched for an item that could help heal him in his inventory, before doing the same thing to his shop, but deep down, he knew that nothing could help him. "Hey! Issei!" Sieghart called weakly, making Issei turn his gaze to him. "Please, promise me, that you will, finish this. Promise me, that you, will bring everyone, home, safe. I promise." A faint smile tugged at his lips as his body began to relax. Summoning the last of his strength, Sieghart raised his hand, tapping Issei's chest lightly with the side of his knuckle. "Good, just know that it's been fun, hanging out, and fighting alongside you, brother." His voice trailed off, his eyes dimming as the light of life left him as his hand fell at his side. Issei just kneeled them and stared at him in stunned silence, clutching Sieghart's lifeless body as a torrent of emotions crashed over him. Sobbing, he lowered his head down and rested his forehead against Sieghart's chest, his tears dripping onto his blood-stained shirt as he balled his hands into fists. "Kill the brat!" Elva snarled, making the troop of ice elves that had rushed her side at Issei, who snapped his head up with his eyes blazing with fury. In a blink of an eye, the elves were sent flying, their bodies being torn to shreds under the devastating force of Issei's attack. "These bastards! I will kill you!" Issei growled as he stood there with fists clenched tightly at his sides and his entire body trembling with fury and grief. His gaze locked onto Elva and Baruka as pieces of crimson armor started appearing around him and strapped themselves to his body with sharp metallic clicks, encasing his entire body in a full set of armor. His eyes, with tears streaming down his cheeks, were the last to be covered, shining brilliantly for a moment before the very air around him erupted. A massive shockwave burst forth, crackling with raw energy and scattering debris in every direction. Flames surged outward in a swirling inferno, melting the frost-covered ground and disintegrating the creeping ice spikes that had spread from the attacks done by Elva as it took the shape of a dragon spreading its wings before shifting its color fully to dark and purple. The sheer force of the dark, menacing aura caused the entire landscape to shake, forcing even the two elves to falter, their confidence flickering for the first time as they gazed at the being standing before them with a hint of fear in their eyes. And for a split second, Baruka saw the silhouette of a certain black-haired warrior in the blazing aura radiating from Issei. "Your pact with YagamiNguyen has leveled up. All associated abilities have leveled up. Boosted Gear's Balance Breaker has evolved. Crimson Scale Mail unlocked. I will kill all of you. Your pact with YagamiNguyen, Fire, has leveled up. All associated abilities have leveled up. Boosted Gear's Balance Breaker has evolved. Crimson Scale Mail unlocked. I will kill all of you. Neat parlor trick." Baruka grinned just as Issei launched himself at him, moving faster than he had done before. This time, however, the ice elf was able to intercept his attack, using his twin daggers to block his fist. Sparks flew as the sheer force pushed Baruka back a few steps, just as it knocked every combatant fighting near them to the ground. His boots dug into the frozen ground as Baruka stopped himself before shoving Issei back to swing his dagger in a wide arc, aiming for his neck. Issei immediately ducked his head down, the blade narrowly missing as he retaliated with an upward, flaming punch. Baruka smirked as he leaned his head back, dodging the blow by inches, then countered with a rapid slash. The dagger scraped against the crimson armor but failed to pierce it, earning a growl from Issei. "Is that all?" he asked. Baruka snarled and lunged forward, driving both daggers down in a vicious overhead strike. Issei raised his arms, catching the blades in his gauntlets. The impact cracked the ground beneath his feet, but Issei twisted his body and sent Baruka flying with a kick to his chest, just as Elva launched frost spikes toward Issei, who ignited the air around him, causing the spikes to instantly evaporate and vanish before they could reach him. "You vermin!" Baruka snarled as he dashed back into the fray, his twin daggers glowing as he charged at Issei with renewed aggression, but a massive swung down and intercepted the ice elf, forcing Baruka to leap back to avoid being cleaved in two. Without needing to say a word to his MSTR as he stood at his side, Gladio raised his great sword in one hand, his eyes glowing menacingly under his shadowy helmet as he pointed a finger challengingly at Baruka with the other. "Heh, that regenerative ability of yours is truly problematic, but I have beaten you once, Shadow. And I shall do it again." Baruka laughed as he surged forward, daggers flashing as he clashed his blade with Gladio, who held his ground with seemingly renewed resolve. With a mighty swing, he pushed Baruka back, but the ice elf was quick to twist around, ducking under a horizontal slash and countering with a stab, but Gladio did not allow the blade to reach him as he swung his sword back, parrying the dagger in a shower of sparks. At the same time, Issei rushed at Elva as she sent a blast of ice wind at him, blasting through it by wrapping himself in dragon fire and charging forward. Flames licked at the air as Issei swung his fist at the elf queen, forcing her to conjure a wall of ice to block the attack. The impact shattered the barrier and melted away a good chunk of it, sending shards of ice scattering around them, but Elva had already flown back, launching another volley of projectiles in rapid succession. Despite the fact that they flew at him fast and managed to overcome to the heat of his flame, Issei was able to dodge all of them, but a sharp pain suddenly shot through his body, causing him to almost get hit in the head by an ice spike, snapping his head to the side just in time to avoid it. "Partner, your body with these injuries right now cannot handle the strain of this new scale mail. Then we need to make every second count, Drake. Watch over my mana for me." Saying that, Issei pushed forward, ignoring the pain that seemed to intensify with each move he made as flames erupted around him in a spiraling torrent, melting the icy terrain beneath his feet as he charged at Elva, who flew up high and summoned a blizzard to halt his advance. Snow and frost swirled violently across the entire battlefield, clashing against Issei as he continued to force his way through the freezing storm before leaping into the air, his dragon wings flaring as he sped up and brought his fist toward Elva like a flaming meteor. The elf queen barely managed to shield herself with a dome of ice, the impact shattering the barrier and creating a shockwave that sent her crashing into the ground. At the same time, Gladio was locked in another brutal fight against Baruka, who laughed like a maniac as he overwhelmed the knight with his superior speed and agility, his daggers flashing in the dim light as he slashed at the Shadow Knight while simultaneously dodging and sidestepping to avoid his giant blade. Holding his ground against the onslaught, Gladio suddenly raised his gauntlet and deflected a deadly blow from Baruka before he twirled around and swung his great sword at him. Baruka instantly blocked it, holding his daggers in an X-shaped formation in front of his chest to keep the giant blade from reaching him, but the force behind it was still enough to send him flying back. Seeing an opening, Gladio lunged forward, appearing right above Baruka with his sword raising over his head. The ice elf swiftly sidestepped the strike, just narrowly avoiding the sharp edge of the blade as it cleaved through the air before slashing with both daggers in rapid succession. Sparks flew as the blade scraped against the dark metal, with each strike leaving a deep gash across his armor, but Gladio held his ground and sidestepped the last strike to backhand Baruka across the face as the elf briefly lost his momentum, sending him away. "Heh, such aggression, what's wrong? Can't keep a cool head anymore after failing your MSTR?" Baruka smirked as he flipped around and landed gracefully on the ground, wiping away the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His gaze locked onto Gladio, who had moved over to Sieghart and lowered himself down to rest a hand on his chest, as if paying his respect to the fallen hero. After a brief moment, Gladio then reached to the side and picked up the black shield lying next to Sieghart, holding it at his side as he stood up. His eyes met those of Baruka again, and with a swift motion, he extended the hand holding his sword outward, making a challenging gesture for Baruka to come at him. Baruka smirked as he prepared himself, his eyes gleaming maniacally just before the two combatants clashed again in the center of the battlefield. As the battle between elves and shadows raged on, Issei charged at Elva once more, his fiery aura intensifying as he pushed through the blast of icy wind she sent at him. Ice spikes shot toward him from every direction, even the ground, but Issei blasted through them with his dragon flame, leaving melting remnants in his wake. Before Issei could reach her, Elva soared even higher into the sky and raised both hands above her head, summoning a mini-storm of icy winds that seemed to swirl into an expanding orb of condensed energy between her palms. The winds across the frozen battlefield howled as she channeled more and more of her power into the orb, causing the air itself, and even the fire that was burning away the tree down below to freeze over. With a shriek, she hurled the orb at Issei, who boosted up his power as many times as he could before launching himself into the air, meeting the orb of ice head-on despite the pain that was washing over his entire body. With a single, powerful punch, he struck the orb, his fiery fist slamming into the icy energy and sending it veering off course, flying sharply to the side to crash into the distant forest. The explosion that followed was immense, an eruption of icy energy that consumed everything in its path. The ground cracked as trees, rocks, and everything in its vicinity were frozen in an instant. Neither party had the time to see the destruction, however, as Issei reached Elva, his fist colliding with her abdomen in a devastating explosion of dragon flame. A shockwave of heat and force blasted outward, scorching the very air around them and sending a ring of melted snow and ice spreading in all directions as Elva was thrown back like a ragdoll, her body crashing into the frozen lake just outside of the hideaway with enough force to break through the ice and sink beneath the surface. The violent splash of water and ice shards erupted into the air as the elf queen was swallowed by the depths below while the entire lake rippled violently from the impact, as if the very earth itself was recoiling from the force of the blow. For a moment, everything was still, despite the ongoing battle in the distance. Issei hovered over the spot where Elva had fallen, his eyes scanning the water, waiting for any sign of movement. The water remained eerily calm for a few seconds, and then, just as he had expected, Elva emerged. Her form, once regal and pristine, was now a broken and battered shell. Several areas of her blue skin were blackened and charred from the blast of heat that had sent her crashing into the lake. Blood dripped and trickled down from fresh wounds visible along her arms and chest, and her breath came in shallow, pained gasps. With a snarl, the elf queen dragged herself from the icy lake, ice and water dripping from her form as she shakily tried to push herself up. Her gaze then locked on Issei as he landed on the ground before her, but the weariness in her posture betrayed the fury and hate she had in her eyes as she looked at him. You think this is over?" Elva rasped, her voice coming in hoarse. "I am the queen of the elves. I am the ruler of this sacred land you are standing on. You will not break me." Issei remained silent. He simply took a step forward, his fiery aura flaring around him as his pace quickened into a run and pulled his fist back, his fire wrapping around him, shifting and twisting into the shape of a dragon. The armor on his back opened, revealing two boosters that unleashed a torrent of flame, propelling him forward at breakneck speed. Boost. Boost. Skill activated, transfer. Skill activated, vital slash. Skill activated, penetrate. With a deafening roar, he shot toward Elva. This ends now. Sensing her imminent doom, Elva struggled to summon what remained of her strength, her body trembling from the wounds she had sustained. Despite the pain, she raised a hand, trying to summon the last of her ice magic to protect herself. "You fool!" Elva spat, gritting her teeth. "I will never fall." But Elva never got to finish her sentence. In a blink of an eye, Issei was upon her. Time seemed to slow around them as the fire dragon around him roared as if it were alive, its fiery maw opening wide with Issei surging forward, engulfing everything in his path in a blazing inferno before throwing his fist at Elva, sending it straight at her face with devastating force. Finishing move, Rage of the Fire Dragon. The moment the blow found its mark, the explosion of flame was blinding. As his fist crashed through whatever defenses that Elva had managed to raise, her screams were drowned out by the roar of the flame dragon as it consumed her, the dragon-shaped fire wrapping around her and swallowing her entire form. The explosion was so intense that it shattered the frozen lake beneath them, the ice cracking and collapsing as the heat spread across the landscape, melting the snow and turning the ground to ash in its wake. Everything within the blast radius was obliterated, leaving nothing but a scorched crater in the ground where Elva had stood moments before as Issei pushed forward, dragging Elva with him while carving a path of scorched earth and destruction in his path. With a final, thunderous impact, Issei slammed Elva into the side of the mountain, the force of the collision sending shockwaves through the earth. The mountain itself trembled, cracks appearing along an entire section of its surface as if the very foundation of the land was being torn apart. Massive rocks and boulders dislodged from the mountainside, tumbling down as the ground rumbled beneath them. The explosion of energy created a massive crater in the mountainside, the impact creating a deep fissure that ran down its length. Issei stood amidst the destruction, looking at Elva as she whimpered weakly for her life, her once glowing eyes flickering dimly with pain, fear, and fury as she was pinned against the jagged rock of the crater, unable to move with her burnt and broken body. The once proud queen of the Ice Elves, now on the brink of death, looked up at Issei with defiance still burning in her eyes. Her voice, hoarse and strained, barely rose above the deafening silence that followed the destruction. "You, all are going to die here," she rasped, her words dripping with venom even as her strength continued to fade. Her chest then rose in one last breath before her arms fell limply down at her side, leaving nothing but an empty stare as her charred body went limp, the last remnants of her life snuffed out in the wake of her defeat. Elva, Queen of the Ice Elves LV 60, defeated. Level up. We will see if you will have anything to say about that. Issei murmured as he pulled his fist back before speaking the command, "Arise." Just a moment earlier, on the other side of the battlefield, Baruka was struggling, finding it harder and harder to overcome the impenetrable defense Gladio now had with Sieghart's shield. Each strike of his dual daggers, no matter how swift or deadly it was, failed to find their mark as Gladio used the shield to block the attack before retaliating with a swift swing of his massive blade, forcing Baruka to stay on the defensive even though he was the one dishing out more attacks. "Tch, how annoying." The Ice Elf scoffed as the tip of his blade was knocked back once again by the wall of steel between him and Gladio, whose eyes then flashed a glowing purple under his helmet as he surged forward, bashing Baruka. The Ice Elf barely managed to catch his footing before Gladio sent his great sword toward him, forcing him to duck his head down to dodge the strike as the blade cleaved through the air with enough force to send a gust of wind in its wake. Swiftly, Baruka retaliated with a quick upward slash of his dagger, but once again Gladio blocked the attack with the black shield in his hand. Losing his composure, Baruka launched a relentless assault at Gladio, aiming for his joints, neck, and pretty much every exposed area that he could find on his armor, but the shield was always there to block each and every strike, generating sparks with every impact. Picking up speed even more, Baruka then darted to the side, his movements fluid as he circled around Gladio. Faking a feint, the Ice Elf then ducked down quickly and slashed his daggers low, his blade targeting the small gasp between the shin and ankles, but Gladio was even faster to switch his stance, lowering the shield just enough to block the attack before surging toward Baruka, kicking the edge of the shield to slam it into his face. The impact sent Baruka stumbling back, his boots skidding across the frost-covered ground. A flicker of pain crossed his face as he steadied himself, but he barely had time to collect his composure as Gladio was right upon him, using the momentum of his movement to strike with his blade. The sword came down with devastating force, and though Baruka managed to sidestep it at the last moment, the sheer weight of the blade cracked the ground where it landed, splitting the earth just as Gladio bashed Baruka, who tried to stab him through the head with both daggers, with the black shield to throw him off balance before shifting his stance to swing his blade at him in a sweeping motion. Gritting his teeth, Baruka wasted no time to leap back, but the tip of the greatsword still grazed his chest and left a deep gash there, causing blood to gush out as the Ice Elf stumbled back. "You vermin!" Baruka snarled, frustration evident in his narrowed eyes as he glared hatefully at Gladio. Before the Ice Elf could make another attempt to strike down the Shadow Knight, an explosion ripped through the battlefield, as a deafening roar of a dragon drowned out all sounds. The shockwave of the devastating attack done by Issei to kill Elva tore through the battlefield, knocking all but Baruka and Gladio themselves off balance. With his eyes widening in shock, Baruka snapped his head to the direction, with one arm shielding his face as the intense heat washed over the entire landscape. "Everyone, look!" A voice cried out from one of the mages fighting in the distance, her words filled with awe and astonishment as a swirling mass of energy appeared in the center of the courtyard, flickering and illuminating the dimmed battlefield. It's the gate, that explosion just now, it must be Issei. He did it. Issei did it. Frank murmured in disbelief before crying out, his voice rising in excitement. The word spread like wildfire, causing cheers to erupt from the heroes and devil combatants alike, their spirits lifted by the sudden hope of escape. The sound of celebration quickly turned to urgency as the elves rushed forward, their swords and magic at the ready. Frank gripped at the sword in his hands as he braced himself along with his fellow devils and supporters, who had fought side by side with him with all that they had to defend the main house, where they kept those who were wounded in the fight and allowed the healers to help them recover. Just as a volley of ice arrows soared through the air toward them, a familiar fiery figure descended from the sky, cutting through the barrage effortlessly. His flame roared as Issei landed in front of Frank and the supporters, causing the elves to falter momentarily at the sight of him. 3 elves rushed at him from different angles, their swords and daggers at the ready to strike him down, but before they could even land a hit, Issei shot forward and tore through them with his flaming fist, sending the elves flying back and crashing into the ground faster than they could blink. "Anyone who can still move, grab the injured and rush for the gate," Issei called out, his voice firm and commanding as he came to a stop, dodging an incoming ice arrow with a fluid sidestep. Without missing a beat, he threw a powerful left hook at the nearest elf, sending the attacker sprawling to the ground. Frank opened his mouth to argue, but a sound in the distance stopped him. His eyes snapped to the horizon, widening in shock and horror. The unmistakable sight of an army of ice elves on horseback surged into view, their numbers vast as they charged forward, their battle cries echoing across the battlefield as their frosted mounts galloped toward the hideaway. The only thing slowing their advance was the massive crater in the ruined lake caused by the fight between Issei and Elva, forcing them to detour around the destruction. But even so, their numbers were overwhelming, and they were closing in fast. Panic, Frank then turned his attention to Issei, but before he could say anything, Issei snapped at him with a cry, "Get everyone to gate, now. My shadows and I will buy you as much time as we can." The lead supporter hesitated, torn between staying and helping Issei and doing what he was told by the young man. Still, the sheer number of incoming elves left him with little choice, and with a final nod, he turned to rally the others. "Go, now!" he ordered, and rushed back himself into the main house to help with the carrying of the injured to their escape. The other captains were quick to do the same, rallying their troops as Issei joined his shadows in battle, doing all that they could to take care of the remaining elves within their camp. Baruka, his clothes in tatters and his body bloody from his gradually losing fight against Gladio, snarled ferally as he attacked the Shadow Knight, only for him to block his strikes again with the dark shield before swinging his blade at him, slashing his chest. The force of the strike forced Baruka back, but Gladio was nowhere near done. Before the ice elf could react, Gladio stomped on his chest with the weight of his armor, pressing him into the frozen ground before kicking him back with his left foot, sending the ice elf tumbling through the snow. Baruka. Just as Baruka managed to pick himself up, he was struck across the face by Issei. His vision blurred for a moment, his body reeling from the unexpected hit before he was launched across the entire battlefield before striking the ground hard, his body tumbling across the dirt like a rag doll that had been thrown by a giant. Each time a part of his body struck the earth, it left indisputable proof where he had landed until his body crashed through a cabin, where his momentum was finally stopped. Despite the damage, the angered ice elf emerged from the crash only a second later, his teeth bared in a feral snarl as he launched himself at Issei, who raised his hand to swiftly deflect the fist aiming for his face and retaliate instantly with a devastating left hook of his own at Baruka. The ice elf endured the pain and snapped his head back, grabbing Issei by the collar of his breastplate and striking him in the stomach with a foot. Despite his new armor, Issei could still feel the force of the blow as he doubled over before being sent backwards by another strike smashing into his face. "You should have taken my offer," Baruka said as he tore away his tattered shirt and jacket while cackling maniacally, fixing his gaze on Issei as he regained his footing and glared hatefully at him from the broken visor of his helmet. His entire body was aching. His strength normally would have been enough to handle the power of the Crimson Scale Mail, but the injuries he had sustained trying to stop Elva from killing everyone with Sieghart had been making it 100 times harder. Still, Issei refused to let the pain show on his face as he kept his gaze on Baruka, who stretched out his hands and declared confidently, a manic grin spreading across his face. "Can you not see it? Soon, all of you will be slaughtered by the full force of our people." His voice was filled with cold confidence as he spoke, his words echoing through the battlefield. "Everyone you have fought here tonight was but a single tribe. Can you feel it? Our number range in thousands, and they are all coming for BLD. Not if she has anything to say," Issei murmured, as Baruka widened his eyes in confusion in response. Before he could open his mouth to speak again, a gigantic blast of ice collided with the front line of the Elven army, sending dozens of them flying just before they could finish crossing the lake. The rest of the army, meanwhile, was blocked off their path as the blast of ice solidified and became a giant wall of ice standing between them and the hideaway, keeping them from advancing further, at least for the time being. "No. Glacia." On his call, a familiar figure, now cloaked in shadow garments and glowing a faint blue where her skin was exposed, floated down and hovered behind Issei. Her eyes glowed with power, exuding an ethereal presence as she gave the shocked Baruka a look of cold disdain before unleashing a blast of freezing wind at him. "Glacia, LV7. Rank, Elite Knight." Baruka quickly summoned his daggers, slashing through the air in front of him to destroy the shards of ice inside the blast, shattering them into harmless fragments before they could reach him. However, despite his swift defense, smaller pieces of ice still pierced through his defenses, grazing his arms and legs and leaving him covered in deep cuts and gashes once it ended. Warning. Baruka has gone berserk. Enemies with the berserk status have increased offensive stats while their defensive stats are halved. "You scoundrel, how dare you? How dare you?" Baruka roared in anger, his eyes blazing red with pure fury as he threw his daggers out at his side and charged at Issei. "I will kill you all." Before he could reach his target, a flash of steel intercepted his path, halting his movement and leaving momentarily shocked before realizing that his side had been slashed by Gladio, who appeared behind him with his bloody blade in hand. Not allowing him a single second to react, the Shadow Knight twirled around and tossed his sword into the air, allowing Issei to use Ruler's hands to pull it down and catch it in his hand as he lunged at Baruka and descended upon him with a slash, splitting his body in two. The sheer force of the strike sent the upper half of the elf tumbling to the ground in a grotesque display, the once proud elf now reduced to nothing but a bloody mess. But Issei did not celebrate the small victory. Hardening his gaze, he snapped around and turned his attention to the army that was slowly breaking their ways through the ice. Some used their magic to open paths within the ice walls, while others had managed to climb over and jump down to rush on their feet toward the hideaway, their eyes burning with hatred while red electricity crackled around their bodies, a clear sign that they had also entered the berserk state like Baruka had been at the sight of their elf queen in her new, revived shadow form. "Please, promise me, that you will, finish this. Promise me, that you, will bring everyone, home, safe." Sieghart's words echoed in his mind as he gazed at the people rushing to the portal around him while helping each other and the injured. The pain was unbearable at this point, worsened by the strains of his new balance breaker, but Issei kept himself on his feet, even as his crimson scale mail started to revert back to its crimson armaments form as his body was unable to hold it any longer. With renewed determination, shown in the flame that surged from his body, Issei gathered every bit of strength that he had left and roared out the command, his voice echoing across the landscape. "Arise!" Frank, who was helping an injured warrior to the gate, watched in awe and astonishment as shadowy figures started to rise from the corpses of the elves lying around the battlefield. It was Baruka that rose first, his hands picking up his daggers as he walked up and joined Gladio and Glacia, standing on his left while the Shadow Commander took his right. The other ice elves soon followed, joining the small shadow army of over 200 strong before Issei charged toward the opposite direction that everyone else were heading, leading his shadow straight into the battle against the army of enraged ice elves, clashing with them in a deafening roar of steel meeting steel. Frank. The moment that he managed to cross over the gate and stumble out, exhausted and covered in the blood and grime of battle, he was immediately surrounded by helpers. He could hear the frantic sounds of medics and warriors already tending to the injured, moving quickly to help and assist those who had made it through the portal that was now behind him, but it was Zeoticus that rushed to his side first, his face etched with worry. Behind him was none other than Rias, and who Frank believed were her servants, their concerned expression matching the look that his MSTR was wearing on his face as they hurried to his side. Issei, he's still in there. Knowing exactly what they wanted to ask him, Frank answered the questions even before they could say it. Rias and Aquino immediately tried to rush in, but Graphia held them back before they could try to do anything stupid. Just when the two girls were about to tell Graphia to release them and let them go, a flash of crimson, followed by a crackle of purple lightning shot past them and entered the gate. Inside, Issei was fighting with everything that he had, his body aching, his mana rapidly depleting to heal his shadow. There were still others that had yet to cross over the gate, but the wall of ice had fully collapsed, allowing the ice elves to seep in the hideaways by waves of hundreds. Led by the shadow of Baruka, Gladio, Tora, and Glacia, his shadows fought fiercely at his side, their shadowy forms cutting down any who dared approach. But, just like him, they were growing weaker as the battle dragged on. There was only so much they could do against such relentless onslaught of berserked enemies. As the battle raged on and the pressure mounted, Issei felt himself being pushed to the brink. His movements gradually slowed, his body feeling heavier and heavier with every passing second as he got hit, slashed and stabbed. The sounds of clashing steel, cries of battle, and the cold, bitter wind filled his ears, but he refused to falter. Not yet. Not until he had fulfilled his promise with Sieghart. He had to bring everyone home. Come at me, all of you. Issei roared, ignoring the notification windows of mana fully depleted and health critical that were being flashed in front of him by the system. Reaching his hand into his inventory, Issei brought out his sword and got ready with Gladio and the shadow of Baruka as another wave of ice elves started to close in. Bzzttt. Boom! Before they could reach him, a gigantic bolt of white and purple lightning struck the very ground before him and his shadows, splitting the battlefield with its sheer power and generating an explosion that sent shockwaves across the battlefield, knocking several elves off their feet and blasting a large portion of their army into oblivion. Issei, who could only watch on in astonishment, snapped his head to the side to see an unfamiliar man walking up to him, his fingers crackling with the same electricity that was still raging across the field. Before the elves could recover, a blast of familiar demonic power surged forward, obliterating hundreds of ice elves in an instant, their bodies disintegrating in a violent burst of crimson and black. The remaining elves could only gaze at the destruction in pure shock and horror, their weapons scattered and their morale shattered by the sheer force of the devastating attacks. Issei. A familiar voice called out, and Issei turned his head to see Surzek's Lucifer rushing at him, feeling a sense of relief that finally allowed him to loosen his body, causing the tolls to finally catch up to him in an overwhelming rush. Fortunately for him, before he could fall over as his knees grew weak, the other man standing on his right had caught him, throwing a hand over his shoulder to pull him right back up. I got you. Let us get you home, lad. You have done well. The man, whose name he would later learn to be Sid, said softly as he helped Issei toward the gate, with the remaining members of the raid being helped out one by one. W8. Issei managed to say, his voice faint as he turned his gaze to Gladio, who stood resolutely at his side, even as the others faded into his shadow. With a solemn bow to him, the knight then turned on his boots and walked toward the body that lay under the vigil of the remaining shadow berserkers. Kneeling, Gladio gently wrapped the lifeless figure in his cloak, lifting it with reverence and respect before standing up to follow Issei outside. There was no cheer, no jubilant cries of victory, only a heavy silence as Issei emerged from the closing red gate with Sid and Surzex. No one spoke anything, not even Rias and the other members of her peerage, who were all overjoyed to see their beloved Issei returning. They could only stand there and watched with the others in sorrow as Issei slipped out of the supporting hold of Sid and Surzex and fell to his knees, tears streaming freely down his cheeks while his gaze stayed on the body Gladio was carrying. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 12. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author YagamiNguyen on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.